Welcome to Noble's third Dialogo. It is a discussion with our very own Matt Kincaid and D. Nigel Green. Today, we are celebrating Black History Month. We're going to dive deeper into what anti-racism is, what it looks like in the context of where we are in America and at Noble. So I'm very, very excited to have these gentlemen here. We'll talk a little bit more about why these two specific men are going to join me today and who I am. I'm Rachel Powers. I am the communications manager for Noble, and I am your host this evening. So, D, Matt, I would like for you to tell us first of all, tell us who you are and about yourself. And how did you come to know that being an anti-racism trainer or facilitator or doing work in anti-racism was your life's work?
Since Matt put himself on mute, I'll begin. D. Nigel Green, and I am Noble's Director of Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity. This is my 11th year at Noble, and I think how I arrived at this position and in this work was pretty much because I was able to navigate, quote unquote minefield of racism on my way here, like being a fully what I felt capable, ready, and prepared individual still was met with obstructions, barriers, politics. And now I was teaching children how to navigate spaces instead of how to change spaces. And for me, it was important to recognize that spaces needed changing, not navigating.
Matt?
Yeah, great answer, D. I think obviously lived experience is the best teacher. For me, my story in terms of how I came here is interesting because I actually led my first anti-racism training when I was 14. So, I don't know how many of the people who are listening to this are in high school right now. A lot of times, especially being a young person, a lot of times you either think or believe, or at least the systems and structures that be make it seem as if you are too young to make change. But in a lot of ways, it feels like anti-racism work chose me. Immediately once I gave up my dreams of, being in the NBA, which was like around 13 years old, anti-racism was the next kind of logical path for me. So I went from wanting to be like Michael Jordan to wanting to be like MLK. But yeah, so I went to this youth leadership program and was introduced to, theories and concepts of systemic oppression. And what it did for me was it gave me a language for the inequality that I saw in my daily life, that oftentimes manifested in me as like, is there something wrong with me because I'm seeing the way that, either I'm being treated by the world, or I see, the differences in the ways in which, people in my family and in my community are experiencing the world versus, people that I interacted with who were either of a different race or socioeconomic class than me. And, having the language and the words to explain that structure, made me understand that not only was I not the problem, but that I had the power to make change. So anti-racism work chose me. I've been doing this work for quite some time. And, now I think about like, what would I have done or what would I have been if systemic racism didn't exist? And so in a lot of ways, I feel like those of us who do anti-racism work, it's less about necessarily like what you want to do and more about, trying to change something so that we don't continue to pass this down to the next generation.
Awesome. And tell us who you are and what's your company, Matt?
Yes, my name is Matthew Kincaid. I should have started with that. I am the founder and CEO of Overcoming Racism. Overcoming Racism is an organization that kind of at the baseline supports institutions both envision and actualize anti-racist change. Most people, when they think about that, they think about these anti-racism trainings, which many noble leaders and staff have participated in, but it's broader than that. It's also thinking about systems and policies and practices, believing that if we change the culture of institutions, then that will often have a larger impact on people's hearts and minds and souls as they engage with the work. So the short way that I like to tell people what I do is that I fight evil for a living. So I'm.
Okay, so tell us, how did you all connect? I want to know the story. So I know that you all are friends in some form, and you have this rapport that I've had the pleasure of being of noticing and witnessing in person. But how did you all connect, and how did you come to know Noble and work with Noble?
Honestly, it was one of the those great honors and pleasures of my life. I think, whether you think it's God or the universe or the ancestors, sometimes just like brings people together in ways that just are meaningful in terms of the fact that like it was inevitable that at some point me and Dee would come together, and inevitable that we would end up in this place where we're both doing this work in schools. Like, it's kind of a really powerful story looking back at it. But I met Dee when I was 20 years old. I was just about to turn 21 years old, but I met Dee when I was 20 years old, and we were both facilitating this youth program, and we were supporting taking these youth around the country. It was a program that worked with Black youth and Jewish youth, and it was like a cross-cultural change exchange program that was a year long. And from that phase to where I am now, it's been an honor and pleasure to kind of watch him grow and to follow in his footsteps and his example.
Yeah. The interesting thing is, so on this youth programming, we toured uh, New York, DC, and all over the South, uh, taking this group of children from St. Louis, or young adults from St. Louis, to these historical monuments, particularly around like civil rights work, social justice work. And I remember we were in Birmingham, Alabama, and we visited the church of the bombing that left 4 little girls um, deceased, and there's a park across the street, Kelly Ingram Park. And I remember it's just like this beautiful moment where Matt gathered everyone there up, like all of our young folks, and some community members as well. And we just had this circle of like laying down your burdens, and this was led by this young man of 20. And there were tears, and like these teenagers were talking about all of the things that were heavy on their hearts and on their minds, and it just really brought us together as a group. And it brought us together, Matt and I, as brothers, from that point on, just seeing like the gift that he had. And so when I knew he was going into education, I knew it was a gift to the world. I knew it was a gift to New Orleans, where he was serving. And when I knew he was doing anti-racist work and I was at Noble, I knew I needed to bring that gift here to Noble.
It was a powerful moment, D. It's been so many years. It's cool to kind of think back and reminisce on that. I think one of our students had lost a close friend or their family member. I think it was a close friend. And so the group, it was just a heavy moment for the group. And so just finding a time to kind of just lift each other up. And then, it was kind of a reminder in that moment of like, we were kind of doing that to really look out for this one particular student. But then, what came out was that like all of us, were carrying things that we maybe didn't give ourselves permission to let other people help us carry it. In this work that we do, you have to sustain yourself. And a lot of times people ask you like, well, what do you do for self-care? What do you do for self-care? And I really struggle with that because, self-care to me is like you had a really hard, week at work or a really hard week at school, and you need to kind of kick back on the weekend and look out for yourself. I don't know if I figured out what self-care is when you are steeped in this work that is fighting against a system that's literally trying to take your life, that is, created all of this hurt and pain and trauma and division, and you're exerting energy against it every day. And I was talking to actually an old professor like last week, and she was like, you know, um, self-care can only get you so far. Like, you also need us care. And, I think a lot of times those of us who commit ourselves to fighting justice don't always do the best job of being like, I actually can't carry this burden on my own. So that was a really powerful moment of, just having the permission to unburden ourselves. I think it's great to be reminded of that, because I think that I can like learn from 20-year-old version of me. Like, as I look back at that, to be like, man, maybe I should take some of my own lessons. And I think having a relationship with, someone like D, it also is something that you need to kind of sustain yourself in this work. To know, he'll text me and just be like, "What's going on? How are you doing? I bet I know something's going on." You know what I'm saying? And it's good to have people like that in your life.
He may not respond for 4 or 7 days, but I'll text him though. And
Like, I love that you all have each other to be able to do that. And I know D is that for me sometimes too. And we'll just check in, what's up, but it's important to have those. Okay, so you meet each other, you're both educators, you kind of go this, New Orleans, D gets to Chicago somehow, and then you become, a full-time entrepreneur, anti-racism hero, right? Like, and then D says, come to Noble. You've been in charter schools before and you had heard of Noble. I know you had known a little bit, but like, what was your first impression when he said, hey, I want you to come to Noble? Like, we got work to do here. What did you think? And I want to see, like, what do you think now? Like, what did you think then? And now that you've kind of been here, like, where are you now on that arc?
I'll just say that, if D says jump, most of the time I'm gonna say how high. So I know he's never gonna lead me somewhere that is gonna be a place where, one, there's a few things that like were the saving grace for Noble in terms of us working with you all. One, I was like, okay, if D is there, then I just have to know and believe that there's good work happening there on behalf of kids. And so, kind of what I knew of Noble at that time couldn't have been the entire story. And I'll tell you what my impression of Noble was before I came. I'll tell you a story about that. It was a scenario where, it felt like a place where there was a lot of really good work that was being done in terms of like, getting certain academic outcomes. I wanted to potentially impact, can we do that in a way that's humanizing and that's culturally sustaining? And can we harness the culture that exists at Noble? Think about if you can build a really strong culture, then you can also build one that's anti-racist. But the only reason why there was apprehension was because this is my first, I'll tell you the story of my first impression of Noble schools. When I was a teacher, my principal, every summer, every new year, your principal comes back with some like new hype plan of like, this is how we are gonna, do the year this year, and everything this year is gonna be great and perfect, and this is why, this is the new plan. You have to hype up for the new year, and you want to shift and adjust, and you want to, improve from the year before. My principal, who's a person I greatly respect, he had been doing some tours of schools, and he came back and told us about his tour of Noble schools. And, we're in New Orleans, Noble's in Chicago. Noble's supposedly having all these amazing results in terms of getting kids to and through college. Great, you know what I'm saying? So he tells this long story about going through Noble schools, and they're going classroom to classroom, and they're, he's watching students work, and he's very impressed with what he sees. And at the end of the tour, whoever's touring him around, I'm not sure who that person was, asked him like, did you notice that? And he was like, notice what? And the person told my principal, this was like the cliche, this was like the climax of my principal's story to the staff. And he said, there wasn't a single shirt untucked, was what this like Noble leader told my principal. And my principal was like, oh shoot, I didn't notice that. Like, he was impressed by that. And so he came back, and we changed a lot of our rules to mirror Noble's rules. And it was what teachers affectionately called the dark year. It wasn't who we were. It was like, if you ever seen Cool Runnings, when they try to be like the Swedes, it was literally exactly like that. And it just wasn't who we were, and it didn't work. And of course, like anytime you're trying to replicate something, it's never all of what Noble was. And obviously there are a lot of good things, but that was my first inclination. We had gone from a school that was not punitive to being extremely punitive, to then, the year after that, I was promoted to being the assistant principal, to doing anti-racism training, and then effectively eliminating suspensions. And so it was this massive pendulum shift, and we saw some major improvements as a result of that. So that was my first impression of Noble, was being a teacher and being like, why is this the goal? Like, why would this be the climax of the story? It wasn't like the kids were working collaboratively. It wasn't that, like, which I'm sure all this was happening, but it was like there wasn't a shirt untucked. And what that communicated to me was that, as educational leaders, we had lost our way a little bit, where compliance was starting to be prize more, especially from like a visual perspective, than perhaps the rigorous and intensive learning, not just from an academic perspective, but from a self perspective. So that was my first impression. Started working with Noble schools. It was actually interesting because I had met some Noble leaders from doing a speech at the School Leaders of Color Conference, and invited me. So I actually did a training at Johnson first, then Mushin, which were mutually exclusive of each other, and then that grew and grew and grew. And now, when people ask me, can we see an exemplar? Can we see like an example of, the perfect places getting this right? I say there is none. However, I list a number of places that I see doing the hard work, that I see growing, that I see changing, that I see embracing, the unknown. And Noble's one of those places. And shout out to everyone who has had the courage to do that. So from where it started to where it is now, Noble went from being a place where I was like, I don't know if I can really vibe with what it stands for, to a place that is, to me, leading right now in terms of saying, hey, this is where we started and this is where we're going. We don't have it all right, but we're on the road.
Thank you for that. That's interesting perspective, especially as we think about like Noble's impact in the charter world, right? Like from where we were, also where we are now. Like how is that impact reverberating across the nation? And to be mindful of that and what that looks like. And I'm glad that with your national and international lens, you are able to see that we're doing something, which is good to hear from me. D, does that kind of summation match and mirror why you called Matt in and said, "Hey, we need to start thinking about this differently"?
Yes and no. So his summation of Noble, I think, definitely resonates. Um, I I call Matt in for that reason, but also for the reason of I'm trying to figure out like how to put this delicately, maybe. Like when you have like well-intended moderates, I guess. How do you push them to the place of discomfort to kind of break some of the molds that we've all been indoctrinated in so that we can do more? You know what I'm saying? Like it's compliance is I think what drew, I'm sorry, a lot of folks to Noble, and that mold just needed to be broken, I think. Particularly like at our campus of Mushin. I think we were potentially trying to do the work ourselves for so long, and it would have been helpful to have an expert, someone that I considered an expert that was passionate about this work and like loved our children in that space to help us break that mold, because I knew that we all cared about that progress and cared about furthering our work. But like we had just been indoctrinated for so long that we needed to make a shift. So yes and no, that was why I brought Maddie in.
Okay, so I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit because this month we're celebrating Black History Month, and I know that you are a master, from me being in your facilitations, of knowing history and making sure that people understand the history and the thread lines of history to where we are now. Um, what is a takeaway that you want people to understand about knowing your history?
My love for history really comes from my love of seeking the truth. People oftentimes ask me, like, Matthew, how do you go to insert stereotypically racist community here or this community there? Like, people always want the like horror stories. So they'll ask me, like, how do you go into these rooms of, in some places like all white people, and you talk about this topic, and like, how do you have the confidence to do that, even when sometimes there are people who vehemently coming to Noble is a fairly safe space. But there are places that I go where, people have not been exposed to these things, where people hold very, very strong and hard beliefs that would be in direct opposition to things that I'm teaching. People say, how do you do that? And what I always answer is the same answer, which is the truth is the truth is the truth is the truth. And what I mean by that is that, when a truth is met with a lie, the lie has to flee. And I think white supremacy, if it is nothing else, it is a lie. And whether it's the way that I was raised, in terms of school, or the media that I watched growing up, or the books that were available to me, that lie of white supremacy doesn't just impact white people, it seeps into our own consciousness. Well, we may start to believe that our origin story started with slavery, or our origin story started with the United States taking native land, or our origin story started with United States moving the border of Mexico, and being the aggressor in the Mexican-American War. And so you start to believe that, like, well, maybe there is something superior about these people, or maybe there is something deficient about me, or maybe my blackness is something to overcome, which just couldn't be further from the truth, right? Like, people of color, black people, brown people, people across the, black, indigenous, people of color spectrum are not in any way, shape, or form broken. If anything, right, we've proven time and time quite the opposite of that. People don't oppress the weak, they oppress the strong. It's the systems that we're navigating that are broken. So for me, my love of history is my love of seeking the truth. And the more that I learn about my history, it's like Marcus Garvey said, the people without the knowledge of their history, culture, and origins, it's like a tree without roots. The first day of my class, we would always look at that quote and dissect that quote with students to understand, like, if you don't know where you come from, you won't know where you're going. But also, racism is permanent until we prove otherwise. And I think the clearest roadmap to ending systemic racism is knowing how it was created, how it's maintained. And if it is an invention of humankind, then it can also be dismantled. And the more that we know and understand history, and the more that we can see the lies that is white supremacy, the more all of us collectively start to realize, even those people who come into my trainings oppositionally, that any white supremacy is to the net benefit of all of us. And so to me, my history is like my armor. And so, I put it on every day.
I love that. I love documentaries, right? And so I've been recently just finding new documentaries to just watch and absorb. And one that I've hadn't seen and I'm surprised was on Reconstruction with Henry Louis Gates Jr. And it was really, really excellent, right? And so I was learning about the Daughters of the Confederacy and how they intended to go into schools and to publishing companies to write the lost cause story and to make sure that they were able to tell the story of the Civil War in their view, right? And so it resonates with me because white supremacy being a lie is like, yes, and it was told over and over and over again to children, to tell to their children, and we wonder how it perpetuates, and that was intentional, right? And so leads me to my next question for you is like, why is this work so, why do you prioritize educators, and why do you start there? I know you do corporate America, I know you do lots of facilitations all over, but I've heard you say that you started with education. Beyond you being a teacher, why is that so important for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the easiest way to answer the question is that, like, the cliche of our children are our future, and if you can change the future generation, like, of course, all of that. But I think, more directly, teaching kids changed me. And you go into a scenario where you're teaching kids and you think that, like, hey, here I am, because of my story, or because of my hard work, or because of the things that I've done, I have so much to give to you. And so I just want to come into the classroom, I want to give of myself to you every day. And then you leave each day realizing that it was really the students who are giving to you. And my students gave so much to me over the course of so many years, that my work in overcoming racism, quite frankly, is like trying to pay off that debt. Because when my students came and interfaced with my classroom, and when they came and interfaced with the school system, despite me trying to work and be a radical and revolutionary within those means, the school system that they experienced, despite all of our good intentions, was not the one they deserved. And one of the things I think about all the time is that, like, if there's anything as close to perfect in this world, it is the young people that we serve. And so my work is about creating a world that is deserving of them, But a lot of the ways that we think about how we educate our kids is as if our kids are these broken vessels that need to be fixed, and we need to prepare them for a broken, for this world. We need to, steep them in these oppressive systems because that's what the real world is going to be like. But the world is not a static place. And so for me, through, the love of young people and the love of the students who gave me everything that they had, even in my own brokenness and even in my own, inability to give them everything that they deserved. And so to me, every single day that I work is, paying off that debt to my kids, but also fiercely fighting for an education system that's deserving of the young people who show up every day wanting and believing in something that's bigger than themselves.
Many of us are reading. Like I said, I love documentaries. We're doing this work at Noble. We are 100% in the work. And so we're devouring books. Dee sends out a list of, things resources to use, right? For Noble to become an anti-racist organization, because that's our commitment. So one of the books, of course, we're reading is How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. And when I read this book, I wanted to immediately call you and say, Matt, I've been a part of your facilitation. What is your response to Kendi's assertion that Black people can be racist?
It's a phenomenal question. And, one of the things I want to preface the question by is that, like, people of color, especially Black people, are not a monolith. If you look through history, Black scholars and Black activists and Black people who've been working to advance our, collective cause have often disagreed. In some ways disagreed in massive ways. I disagree with Kendi's assertion that Black people can be racist. And that is not meant to diminish Ibram X. Kendi as a person. I was a big fan of his book Stand from the beginning, but it is I think reflective of the broader canon of work that has been built and shaped over decades, and I would honestly say generations, much of which has been built and shaped by Black women. And so I don't think that one person gets to unilaterally change that. And so a lot of the scholarship that, the things that I present in the workshop aren't necessarily my ideas, right? Like, you all get the resource list, you all get the book list, I'm spouting out books every 5 minutes as I go through, everything that I am, Sharice Jackson, is a Black woman who's the first person to train me in anti-racism when I was 14 years old. Much of everything I am is really derived from the sacrifices, especially the intellectual sacrifices that Black women have made to introduce these theories and concepts to the world. And I think that as a Black man, myself and Kendi, we perhaps have a different perspective because, our male privilege gives us a different vantage point. And so, for me, I think thinking about either standpoint theory or just in general, like Black radical feminist thought, I think that we have to look to the people who have been pushed further to the margins and elevate their voices and perspectives. And so I just don't think that Kendi gets to by himself unilaterally rewrite. And maybe, who knows, in 10, 15, 20, 30 years, like, this book stands the test of time and it enters into the lexicon of the canon of this work. And maybe it shifts, the thought that exists in the space. But until then, I'm not going to erase Angela Davis, and I'm not going to erase Kimberly Crenshaw, and I'm not going to erase Beverly Tatum, and I'm not going to erase, the scholarship of Black women. So, I guess to give people a broader perspective on the disagreement, because people may not be aware of like the context behind it. Racism is a system of advantage first. And the reason why I think is not just semantics or nomenclature to say that Black people can't be racist is because when you say that Black people can be racist, then you no longer examine racism through a power analysis. And it's important to have a power analysis when talking about racism and white supremacy, because without that power analysis, it just makes it seem like people of color, or in this case, Black people, are just being too sensitive. But the thing that is really important to understand is that, like, I don't lose sleep over a white person being mean to me. I don't lose sleep over a white person calling me a name. I don't lose sleep over an individual white person maybe having the power to not give me a job or to refuse me service or to discriminate, against me in some way. Is that nice? No. Do I think I'm a pretty likable person? Yes. Do I think it's their loss if they hate me? Thank you, D. If they hate me even before they know me or prejudge me? Yeah, sure. But I don't lose any sleep over that. What I do lose sleep over, though, is, if I have to interface with the healthcare system and the data and statistics that says I will have a worse outcome because of the color of my skin, or if I have to interface with policy or the housing market or the education system, or economic structures more broadly. When we start to think about racism as a systemic dynamic, what people of color are really fighting against isn't this person to person interpersonal conflict with white people. We're fighting against systemic oppression. And so even if I were to, per se, discriminate against a white person, let's say I mistreat a white person because they are white. That is wrong. That is bad. I prejudge them and I discriminate against them. I'm not even trying to equivocate that, like, that is somehow less significant than if the person does that to me. That's wrong. I should not have done that. But that's not what we're fighting against when we say anti-racism. Because when that white person goes out into the world that I have mistreated as a person, if they get pulled over by the police, they are still white. If they have to go get a home loan, they're still white. If they have to interface with the system of policy and the dynamics of who our policymakers are and who they make policy to advantage, they still are white. Me discriminating against that white person, me being prejudiced and discriminating, does not remove them from the advantages that they receive as a consequence of white privilege. And if we don't name that, and if we don't make that the thing, and if we don't talk about white supremacy as a power dynamic and power structure, then we reduce racism to people being mean to one another. And that's not in any realm of the imagination what I wake up to fight against every day. Do I want people to be nice to each other? Yes. But you don't need every single white person to like people of color for racism to end. You just need to change the systems. That's it. And so that's where me and Kendi have a fundamental disagreement, is within the power structure. But respect to him and respect his opinions and respect to him diverging from the other scholarly positions within this work. But we just fundamentally disagree.
I think about it like this. This is my quick way of always like viewing this. If I were to go to some North Side communities in Chicago and be perceived as a danger, an outsider or a foreigner, um, there is a system in place that will come down and remove me in one way, shape, or form from that place up north. If I look at this in a reverse, if a person from Lakeview came to my neighborhood, let's say a white person from Lakeview came to my neighborhood, um, and let's say like walking through my neighborhood, even though they were the quote unquote outsider or foreigner at that point, if at any point they felt danger, there is still an entire system that is set up to protect them to the point where they would disrupt my entire neighborhood to make that individual feel safer. And so like that's how I view like individual versus like systemic. There is a system in place to protect whiteness.
So what do you say to the people that say, oh, well, I mean, there are Black police officers now. We've got Black pilots. Heck, we had a Black president. All right, listen, you go to any city hall, you go to any state capital, you're going to have Black legislators. You got Black mayors. Heck, Black women are running Chicago. What do you say to those like that? Like they're in power.
Yeah, I think that is a fundamental misunderstanding of what white supremacy is. So Steve Biko, he was a anti-apartheid activist in South Africa. And quite frankly, he reminds me a lot of the guy behind me, John Lewis. If you think of like Nelson Mandela as like Dr. King, Steve Biko is more like either your John Lewis or even probably even more. It's probably like Fred Hampton, who hopefully folks will see on Friday, the movie that's coming out, Black Messiah, which is about Fred Hampton, which took place in Chicago. So, Steve Biko says there's no greater weapon in the hand of the oppressor than the mind of the oppressed. And so does white supremacy conspire to have people of color work to maintain and uphold it? Sure, of course it does. Is that the fault of people of color? No, it's the fault of the system and structure. And so if we have beef with that, then we need to look no further in the system. I think people who say, well, there was a solitary black person who was in power, doesn't that then mean that white supremacy doesn't exist? Well, no, of course not. I mean, if you think about it, the first black governors, and when you just talked about Reconstruction, first black senators, people don't really realize that, but that took place in the late 1800s. And, the only successful insurrection we've had in the United States was to overthrow a government that elected black officials in the 1800s. And so this idea that having or holding or having proximity to power somehow eliminates the realities of white supremacy is just unfortunately a very common misreading and misunderstanding of what white supremacy is and what it does. And so, we can be agents of change or we can be complicit in the structures. And a lot of people do that as a means of survival. And so I don't blame people of color for how they respond to systemic racism, because if the system wasn't in place in the first place, then, people wouldn't have to either co-opt it or spend their whole life fighting it.
I think it's tougher for me to respond to that because I'm often so taken aback by that argument. Like it doesn't seem rational that someone can like make that statement considering the I don't know, the figures and the data just don't back it up. The history just doesn't back it up. you know, if I look at, the number of, we have Madam Vice President Kamala Harris now, right? Whom we're all very proud of. And actually, it was beautiful to see her during the inauguration. When I think about, she's been one of 6 senators throughout history, it just deflates that argument for me, right? Like, there's been 6 black senators, there's been hundreds of non-black senators, right? Like, just to say the least. And not to mention, like, the majority of them are still white senators, or even when I think of what is happening in reaction to Georgia turning blue this year. There's been 133 new laws produced in southern states for voter suppression, as a way to suppress the votes of people of color to ensure that that doesn't happen again, right? Like, so like the history and the data and the facts just don't back up that argument. So I'm often taken aback when I hear that because for me, it's just not logical. Like I struggle with that a lot.
Yeah, I don't think it's a good faith. I agree with D. I don't think it's a good faith argument, right? I think people try to find, really minute ways like poke holes in the system and the structure, which to D said, the data, the facts, the figures, the history. The truth is the truth is the truth. So it all brings us back to the same place. We have a problem. We can either, talk around it or we can address it.
So my director of communications, David Brown, who's supporting this recording, he was lucky enough to have you as his speaker for his Broad graduation. Broad, I think I said it right, Broad graduation.
Bro.
And he says, with great regard, how he remembers your speech, Matt, and that you talked to him, or well, you talked about 381 days of the Montgomery bus boycott. And so I think about what you just said about, dissension, and like there's no monolithic Black community, and the bus boycott, we know, was not supported by every single person in Montgomery at the time, but majority, right? So why is this a salient topic for you to share with leaders?
I think actually the very first time I learned that the Montgomery bus boycott was 381 days was in that program, Cultural Leadership, that me and D met while facilitating. And I can't remember if that was when I was a student in the program or when I met D and I was a facilitator in the program. But it probably was when I was a facilitator in the program, because the very first time I gave a speech that mentioned that was when I was in college. And basically the premise of why that 381 really stuck with me was because the way that we oftentimes learn history, it's like, oh yeah, Rosa Parks sat on a bus, then Black people marched for a couple of days, and then boom, integration, racism ended. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's really the way we learn Black history, like straight up. Rosa Parks, I mean, it's been reduced so just nonsensically to like Rosa Parks was tired from work. She was just too tired to get like literally this is being taught in schools that Rosa Parks, she was a seamstress and she was just so tired from work that she just that day just couldn't move her feet. She just couldn't get up and she stood her ground. It's like how much more can you reduce Rosa Parks? Like it's such a metaphor for our history. So it shouldn't be a shock to me that the bus boycott was 381 days, but it was when I first learned it. I was like, that's over a year. I don't like waiting 2 days for my Amazon package to arrive. Like I'd be like, click and refresh, like what's going on? Let alone don't let it be late. You know what I'm saying? And as an anti-racist, I shouldn't be using Amazon anyway, but I'm weaning myself off. It's a process. But the point is, I think a lot of times what we cut out of history is just how the long pathway to change. And the way that I thought about 381 is always this idea of like, just imagine what it felt like on day 50. You have energy, 50,000 Black people doing something in solidarity, some white people joining in to do so. On day 75, you create this interconnecting carpool structure because we still need to get people from work to and from work safely, especially Black women, where it was very unsafe for Black women in the South, especially in Alabama, to walk. Right. And so this interconnected system where we're sharing cars and, basically literally Uber before Uber. And then, this isn't exact, but I'm just using a metaphor. Then let's say day 120, the city bans that because the city, of course, like bans that carpooling system they created. Now you're feeling defeated. I imagine what it was like on day 200 when you get into an argument with your spouse because your neighbors next door lost their jobs for participating in the bus boycott and you want to continue, but your spouse wants to stop because you have to put food on the table for your kids and the movement is important to you, but you have very real material needs. Some people have been brutalized and been violated, and now you and your spouse have gotten into an argument and you go to sleep angry that night. I think about day 300. I think about day 365 when it's been a year. And on one hand, it's like this major milestone of we've made it a year. On the other hand, though, you've gone a year and not only has quote unquote nothing changed, it's actually gotten worse for you because the city has been exerting opposite pressure against you. It's been making your life harder as a Black person to do this. And we just kind of learned the history as if it just was a thing that happened. But imagine if people would have quit on day 365, but they kept going till day 381. And kind of my big metaphor of this is like, I think a lot of us as people fighting against racism, we are on our day 365. We've been working, we've been toiling, we've had some victories, but we've taken a bunch of losses. And there's so many external forces telling us that things won't change. They had no assurance. Like we look back at the Montgomery bus boycott and we're like, oh, it was successful. But they had no assurance that this was gonna work. I mean, there have been some successful boycotts in other places. Montgomery was not the first, but in terms of in that major city, they had no assurance it was gonna work. And so it's about pushing on into day 31. But beyond that, the thing that people miss in the story was that Rosa Parks actually founded the Committee for Equal Justice in 1944, 11 years before the Montgomery bus boycott. And she founded the Committee for Equal Justice to fight against rape and sexual assault that Black women had closer proximity to in the South. And she led that organization for 11 years and grew a grassroots organization that before the Montgomery bus boycott changed its name to the Montgomery Improvement Association. A young charismatic minister by the name of Dr. Martin Luther King is placed in charge of that in 1955. He was 26, but it was Rosa Parks who built that organization. It was Juanita Abernathy, whose husband's more famous than she is, Ralph Abernathy, Dr. King's right-hand man, who was the architect of the Montgomery bus boycott. It was Joanne Robinson, who was a woman who with her students printed out the 50,000 flyers to spread the word and to advertise for the movement. And so all these Black women have been erased from this, right? Recy Taylor was the story that sparked Rosa Parks creating the Committee for Equal Justice. Claudette Colvin was the Black teenager who sat on the bus and was arrested before Rosa Parks. And so for me, I think that story is just a reminder that like change takes time. We can't give up on day 365. We have to go until the day 31. And I never know the seeds that I'm planting today 11 years later, what could happen. There's no way in 1944 Rosa Parks knows what she does in 1955. And so it's just an encouragement for me to keep going.
Which is also why working with educators matter, because we're gardeners. those are the seeds being planted.
You've seen Noble. I'm gonna bring it back to Noble a little bit. You've seen Noble's anti-racism commitment. I want to know two things. One, what are your thoughts about what it says? Just what it says. Just if you have any thoughts about that. But more importantly, what would you say you expect the process of working to become an anti-racist organization will look like, or could look like, or should look like? Like, what would you expect to see?
Noble's anti-racism statement. I do not have it in front of me now. But here's what I'll say impresses me about one. Anyone who's ever known me or interfaced with me knows that like my work requires that I am honest. So just because this is a Noble produced engagement does not mean that I would heap praise upon Noble. I told you all the story of what my first impression of Noble was, and told that story honestly. I'm impressed with Noble's statement. I'm impressed with Noble's actions against systemic racism so far, being that Noble has a long way to go, as does everybody, because Noble has done something that I'll tell another really quick story before you get to the statement. I'll make it fast. CJ, Noble CEO, texted me in the beginning of the year, right before she was going to speak at you all's kickoff. Hey, we're going to be talking about anti-racism. I'd really appreciate if you can attend. And I just so happened to have like some time, and I logged on and I caught CJ's speech, and I caught a couple of the panels that were after that. And I watched and I cried. And I cried not like just because of what was being said, but I cried because it was a reminder to me that one, my work isn't in vain, but also that like change can happen when people put justice over comfort, when they put progress over fear, when we put children over ourselves. And what happened at the Noble convening that made me cry was not just that Noble was saying, hey, we're going to work to be anti-racist. Because around that time, just about everybody was saying that. You know what I'm saying? I mean, Aunt Jemima now is like Pepper Ridge Farms pancake batter, whatever it is, like cotton gin pancakes. Everyone has basically, I don't know what the real name is, but it's close to what I just said. Everyone's coming out saying, hey, we're going to be anti-racist, we're going to be anti-racist, we're going to be anti-racist. And obviously our work with Noble started before that, and Noble's work with this started before that. But what impressed me about Noble then, and what impresses me about the statement now, is that Noble named and has acknowledged and continues to acknowledge in no uncertain terms that it has been a part of the problem and that it has caused harm. And I think that, when we start talking about like healing a wound, it's kind of like the Malcolm X quote where it's like, America, put a knife in our back and it just pulled it a few inches out, right? I think a lot of people are like, oh, we're going to be anti-racist. Like, let's pull the knife out, or let's finally see that there's been harm done, but we're not going to go back and we're not going to tend to the wound. And I think what Noble is trying to do is tend to the wound and to realize that Noble, just like every other institution across this nation, has been complicit. And that complicity requires not just forward thinking, but it requires, contrition, and it requires action that addresses, disparities and pain and harm from the past. I think one of the reasons why our country is so wrapped up and intertwined with white supremacy is because there are no villains in United States history. We don't wrestle with the evils that exist within our lexicon. So much so that people are trying to say we should have this only patriotic education where we ignore, the very real horrific things that have taken place in our country's history. And as long as you don't pay the debt that has been incurred, as a result of people of color being, perpetually exposed to white supremacy, then we'll never actually close the gap. We can change a policy here, we can change the system here, we can say, let's focus on moving forward. We have to address the harm and the pain of the past. So I'm very impressed with Noble's statement, and I'm very optimistic. Noble, like every other organization, is going to struggle. Noble at times will lose its way. Noble at times will wonder if this was all worth it. But the reality is, and what I'm hoping to see happen across the country, which Noble has at least embraced, is that until we have the courage to say we're going to radically do things differently, we will continue to have the same outcomes for the children who deserve and need, an education that system that worked for them the most. And so for me, it's the reimagining of what education could be, while also acknowledging the harm that education, as it is currently constructed, has done. So I feel like, in this work, I'm fairly hard to impress, but I am impressed. But I think with that statement comes a greater sense of responsibility, because Frederick Douglass said when you read his essay about learning how to read, that when you learn how to read, he would have likened the position of the worst reptile. He's trying to think of like the most scorned animal to his own. What Frederick Douglass is basically saying when he says that he likened the position of like the lowest reptile to himself was that now that he could see the systems and structures for what they were, there was no turning back. It's harder as a person of color to exist in an organization that commits to doing the right thing and doesn't, than it is to go into an organization knowing that you may be exposed to white supremacy. And so I think what Noble has done is commendable and it is amazing, but it also is going to require a greater sense of accountability. And so I'm very impressed. I'm very proud. I sing the praises of Noble's transformation, the process of transformation across the country. But I also, with that, know that I'm going to have to be better for as long as Noble continues to work with me, and Noble's going to have to be better. We have to elevate what we've done so far. Is going to have to be taken to the next level.
Absolutely. D is a equity, inclusion, and diversity director. That's on you, bruh. I'm just putting that squarely in your box. No, I take it back. I take it back. We all have a part to play.
I was going to say, it is on us. Like, it is on us. And I am proud to do the work that Jennifer and I have, chosen to take on. And we recognize that, as a community, we have to be better. And that takes leadership acknowledging that. That takes us as individuals in every role acknowledging that. And it takes our own growth across this network. So I'm excited to help in that and be an activist in that work. And I know it's all of us.
That means you, if you're a young person watching this, we need you. Matter of fact, what you all think or do, or the way you all lead or push Noble is going to be far more important. One of the things that's really interesting that I think like must be said is that the anti-racism initiatives at Noble did not start, certainly with overcoming racism, did not start with D. Nigel Green, did not start with CJ, did not start with Jennifer. What this actually started with, and this is a very important part of the story, is student activism. And a lot of the resistances that students in the past have been punished for, whether those resistances were like the most planned out thing or not, in terms of saying, this is a planned action against oppression, a lot of those resistances were saying this isn't working for us. And so where Noble is now is a direct result of student activism. None of this happens if students haven't over time loved Noble fiercely enough to critique it and to say that this is great, but it could be better, and that this could work for more of us. So, I think what gives me hope about Noble moving forward is that like students are being put at the center, and students within Noble schools have already proven to be able to overcome some insurmountable odds to push and shape and change this organization. And so I think that this is a result of adults listening to the young people. And I just want to say to any young person who may be listening, thank you, because we could not have walked through this door. I certainly could not have worked with the teachers if it wasn't for you. You all are the ones that have sparked this, and you all are the reason why we are doing our best as adults to carry your vision through. But we need you, and we need your guidance, and we need you to keep holding us accountable when we stumble, so we can learn.
Okay, very last question. Paint a picture for me. What does America look like after overcoming racism?
I always say that, if you ever think about like the United States without white supremacy, it kind of like hurts your brain or breaks your brain, which is interesting because you can't get to a destination unless you've envisioned it. The fact that we can't, in many cases, or oftentimes it's very challenging to envision the United States without systemic racism is kind of like one of the many things that keeps white supremacy so firmly in place. But my answer to the question is, what will the United States look like without white supremacy? Well, it will no longer be the United States. Unfortunately, white supremacy and the United States are, directly intertwined. But what it could be is something much greater. And I think that when you think about the founding fathers and when you think about people who formed this union, there were some ideals that were promoted that are really powerful and transcendent. The ideals that all people are created equal, the ideals that everyone should have the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness, or what was originally written, property. The ideals of democracy, and that we can collaborate together, and we can have different ideas, but we can push each other on each side to like get to a medium that works for people. Like, there are a lot of really beautiful ideals about what was written on paper by the United States. And unfortunately, as a consequence of white supremacy, we haven't lived up to those ideals. If you truly love the United States, at least from a ideals perspective, then you have to be an anti-racist. Even, if you are a capitalist, which I have my, significant critiques of capitalism. Capitalism is predicated on free and fair markets. Well, the markets can't be free or fair if you have sexism or racism or ableism, or the list goes on. And so everything about what America says that it is, or really the United States, should perfectly gel and align with our work. So then why is it that when people fight against white supremacy, they're called unpatriotic or un-American or whatever the case may be? And so I think what is necessary in this country is another revolution of thought, and one where we actually can commit ourselves to being whatever it is that we say that we are on paper. And I think that that is the development of a new nation, that hopefully holds on to some of the initial founding ideals that were good and great and powerful and meaningful, but one that is committed to executing them. We can be what the ideals of the United States are, but we can't ever get there. Like, anyone who truly loves America should know that, like, we have to build something new. So equity is a state when you can no longer predict positive or negative outcomes based upon these superficial and many times artificially constructed groups that we exist in. So to make answer your question more simply, it will look like a world where people have the freedom to live and to make mistakes and to learn from those mistakes, and aren't judged based on their gender or race or social class or sexual orientation, or the list goes on. But I think that that's a radical reimagining of the United States with a commitment to live up to its ideals.
You want me to follow that answer?
Listen,
I
listen.
offer for you to go
Look,
first.
I should ask that question first.
Look, it looks like Matt and I being unemployed in this industry and in this fight so that we can finally play this 2K game. That's what it looks like.
That's exactly what it looks like. Cannot wait.
I hear that 100%. Like, I have so many more questions, but part two, okay, coming soon. Well, I appreciate you all both for your time, your energy, your intention, your thoughtfulness, and your honesty, right? Because this work, as you said, Matt, is not done without honesty. We have to seek the truth. And so I 100% appreciate you all being here and sharing of yourselves and sharing of your work with us. And that's it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.